Chapter 4. Flight into the Fog. The next day dawned, mild and clear. After a big breakfast, Harvey worked willingly with Dan at their chores. They washed the plates and pots from the crew's meal, then helped send the fishermen out in their dories. They sliced pork for the midday meal and carried coal and water into the cook. As they filled the lamps and swabbed the deck, Dan talked and Harvey listened, eager to know everything about his new life. "One thing I got to warn you about is Penn," said Dan. "I mean, not exactly him, but about reminding him who he really is." Harvey's eyes brightened at a mystery. "Who is he? He's not nearly as big and strong as the rest of the men." "That's because he's really a preacher, or was, I should say. Right now, Penn ain't himself, but he's no wise dangerous." "Oh?" said Harvey rather sharply. "Is that really so, or is it just another of your father's famous judgments?" Dan rested on his mop for a moment. "No, it's the truth. Dad told me that Penn had a wife and 4 children back in Pennsylvania where he did preaching. One day they went to Johnstown for a church meeting. First thing you know, the Johnstown flood happened. Near wiped out the whole town. Uncle Salters, my dad's brother, then took care of Penn on his farm ever since the accident." "Why, I've heard of that flood," said Harvey excitedly. "A dam burst." "That's right," said Dan. "The flood swept away Penn's family right before his eyes. He got saved somehow, but his mind cracked from losing his wife and kids like that. He wandered off, and Uncle Salters kind of found him, but he don't remember any of that life." "I'll be careful not to remind him," said Harvey. "But how come he's here and not on your uncle's farm?" Harvey finished his section of the deck before replying. "Penn's church finally traced him and wanted him to come home, but Uncle Salters was against it. He says if Penn ever remembers who he is and what happened, he'll just up and die. So Uncle Salters sold the farm, and him and Penn signed on to the We're Here to Fish. The church wouldn't think of hunting for Penn on the banks." As they swabbed the deck, Dan kept an eye on his father, who sat smoking near his cabin and watching an increasing number of schooners surround the We're Here. It was well known that Disco Troop could smell out the best fishing grounds around, so other boats followed him closely. While Troop appreciated this tribute to his powers, it did not suit his pocket. Yesterday's fishing had brought fewer and smaller cod than the previous catch, and he predicted the same for today's. Drawing deeply on his pipe, he tried to take the viewpoint of a 20-pound cod and decided where the big fish would have gone, considering the recent gales, currents, and his favorite food. After an hour of almost trance-like thought, Disco Troop rose, took the pipe from his teeth, and nodded his head confidently. When Dan saw this, he judged it was safe to approach his father. "Dad, we've done our chores. Can we take my dory out for a spot of fishing?" "You're free to go, Danny." Whenever he called his son Danny, it was a sign that he was pleased with life. "But get Harvey into some decent rig," he added. "I never saw anything so terrible as that red jacket and white shoes of his." Delighted, Danny dragged Harvey down into the cabin and began rummaging through a locker. Soon Harvey was outfitted in a heavy blue jersey, clean but patched, an oilskin hat and slicker, and a pair of rubber boots that came halfway up his thighs. "Now you look like a fisherman," said Dan with a smile. The boys lowered Dan's little red dory, the Hattie S. Dan jumped in lightly and frowned at the clumsy way Harvey tumbled in after him. "That's no way to get in a boat," he said. "You've got to learn to meet her as she comes up." Harvey accepted the criticism because it was obvious he was far from imitating Dan's easy drop. Next, Harvey's rowing drew Dan's exasperation. "Short. Row short," he ordered. "Else the sea will just whip your oar around if she rises. You're not on an Adirion back pond. You know, this dory's all mine. Ain't she a daisy?" Harvey spoke between gasps as he tried to pull short strokes with his oar. "Yes, very nice. I might ask my father to get me one or two." As if to pay him back for his smug comment, a sudden swell of the sea seized Harvey's oar and smacked the top of it under his chin with a hard crack. "That's what I meant about rowing short," said Dan. "I had to learn too, but I was 8 years old when that happened to me last." As Harvey got back into position, frowning and rubbing his jaw, Dan went on. "No good getting mad at things like that. Dad says it's our own fault if we can't handle him." Dan didn't anchor the dory, but let it drift until he could estimate the best spot to fish. He showed Harvey how to bait his hook with a salt clam and then feed down the line without snarling it. By the time Harvey managed to get his line ready, Dan was already pulling in a cod. As it flapped alongside the dory, Dan called, "The muckle, Harvey, the muckle." Harvey had no idea what Dan wanted, but looked in the corner of the boat where Dan was pointing. He decided that the large wooden hammer was what Dan wanted and quickly handed it over. Dan grabbed it and stunned the cod with a blow. Then he hauled it in and removed the hook. At that moment, Harvey felt a tug on his own hook. He pulled the line up easily. "Why, these are bunches of strawberries," he cried. "Don't touch them," shouted Dan, but Harvey had already pulled them from his hook to admire them. They were perfect reproductions of the land fruit, except there were no leaves. The stems were scaly and slimy, and the fruit was covered with sharp, pointed spines. Dan's warning had come too late. Harvey's hand had already been stung by the strawberries' needle-like spines. "Ouch!" he cried, and flung them back into the sea. "Now you know what a strawberry bottom is," said Dan. Harvey smiled, then baited up again, having learned another lesson of the sea. The instant he let down his hook, the line flashed through his hands. "What is it?" he cried. "It feels like I've caught a whale." Dan peered into the water where something large and white flicked. "Halibut, I think. Looks about 100 pounds. Let me help you." "No, you won't," shouted Harvey. "It's my first fish, and I'll get him alone." His knuckles banged against the side of the boat and began to bleed, but he held on. Sweat streamed from his face, which was almost purple from exertion. For the next 20 minutes, the halibut circled and struggled. Dan stood ready with the muckle. Then, just as Harvey reached the limit of his endurance, the fish gave in. It flopped alongside, Dan whacked it, and Harvey heaved it into the dory. Harvey could hardly believe he had caught such a large gray monster. Though every inch of him ached, he had never been happier or prouder. At that moment, a pistol shot cracked through the air, and a potato basket was run up in the rigging of the "We're Here." "What's it mean?" asked Harvey. "Dad wants everyone back on board. He's got some plan, or else he'd never break off fishing this time of day." The crew responded quickly to Disco Troop's summons. At first, he only said to them, "We'll start the dressing down now. Get out the table and knives, Danny." But as they started cutting and salting the catch, Troop explained, "Boys, you can see for yourselves on this table there's no cod over 15 pounds. Harvey's halibut is the last big fish we'll see in these parts. So we're moving on, away from this crowd. Leave them to bait big and catch small." Uncle Salters looked up from ripping out backbones. "When are we getting underway, Disco?" "I'm waiting on the weather. Otherwise this crowd will just tail along." Harvey looked at the clear sky and wondered what the captain saw there. But a half-hour later, the bank fog dropped on them. It curled and smoked along the colorless water, sealing each boat into itself. Without a command or a word to each other, the men stopped gutting cod and ran to heave up the anchor and raise sail. With Disco Troop at the wheel, the We're Here silently stole away from the other fishing schooners and into the whirling fog.